Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today is the 4th of August. Today we're looking at really important developments beginning with the Kostyantynivka front. Then going northwards, there is a lot to look at around the Pokrovsk direction. But most importantly, there are a lot of movements on the eastern suburbs of Toretsk. We have to keep an eye out for those developments. They are changing really quickly right now. And so we're going to begin by looking at Kostyantynivka. We're going to finish off by looking at the unveiling of the F-16s by Zelensky earlier today. I'm going to just break down all the publicly available information about the F-16 and all the other equipments that are being given to Ukraine as a sort of appendage. But let's begin by looking at the updates that are marked with the yellow polygons. And so you can see, first of all, that over here in the region just southeast of Vodiane, the Russian forces have been able to continue exploiting their gains. They're advancing through a really specific path, which is one that has to be noted. It's on low-lying elevation, but I do understand why the Russians advanced through here. It's not a paved road, but there is a path that is adjacent to various tree lines that leads directly towards the highway in another area, because the Russians are now going to try to just completely take it over throughout its entirety in between Vuhledar to Kostyantynivka, and they also want to clear out all of the flanks that you see sort of bulging right now, the salients that the Ukrainians still hold on to with trenches or in tree lines. They want to just clear out all those remaining holdouts and get a more solid line around the T0532 highway, and then from there continue exploiting advances along ridges. But now they're still making the initial forays towards the Ukrainian line around here, where you don't really have a lot of static Ukrainian defenders, but there are still some physical boundaries, of course, due to the road and due to various tree lines in the region. And so here you have a video from August 1st. So this is actually a bit of an older one, but I only saw it today. And so it's from the Granite units, which is the drone element of the 72nd Mechanized Brigade, one of Ukraine's main units involved in defense here. They destroyed a Russian BMP-2 with FPVs just to the southeast of Vodiane, as I said. And what this shows is a maximum Russian gain amounting to, let's see, about 1.7 kilometers, so it is significant. And it means the Russians are only about, you could say 2.2 kilometers away from Vodiane. Really important village, because as you can see, it really does act as a glue between Vuhledar and Kostyantynivka. Even now that the road is no longer going to be used directly, Vodiane is going to be a means by which the Ukrainians could try to organize their front line sort of status and positions in this really wide array of fields that are in between these two villages that you see marked with this 14-kilometer distance. And so between all of those fields and all those defenses, there's only one village that is sort of sticking everything together, that's really maintaining a cohesive line, and that is Vodiane, because you do have a lot of the frontline companies stationed within this village or in the nearby coal mines, and the loss of Vodiane, or at least taking over the heights on which it's located, would really embolden the Russians and would create a really large wedge in between these two different nodes of Ukrainian defense in southern Donetsk, and then isolate them from one another, which then makes it easier for the Russians to then, of course, divide and conquer, flank them from various directions, utilizing elevation advantages, and then go for the easier option, which could be Kostyantynivka at the moment due to the Russian movement nearby and due to their acquisition of heights. The Russians, I'm saying, overlooking the river valley on which Kostyantynivka is located. And so the Ukrainians have to be careful in this part of the front line, because the Russian forces do have a definite interest in actually crossing over the road here and beginning actual assaults towards Vodiane to try to take it over and then diminish the cohesiveness of the Ukrainian line over here. As you can see over here, there was actually a Ukrainian tank that set a position pretty close to Vodiane, trying to fire upon nearby Russian forces that were moving towards the highway, and it was actually spotted by the Far Eastern Wind UAV unit, and they struck that tank with 2 FPVs and destroyed it in the process. But then going further north to look at other movements, you can see the Russian forces are really beginning to close down and solidify control over the southeastern outskirts of Kostyantynivka. They are also now expanding their zone of control within the village itself, including this block over here, taking over new houses. And we know a lot of this because of footage coming out from the 79th Air Assault Brigade. They released footage just today showing their actual operations using these drones, destroying one Russian tank and 3 armor fighting vehicles. And they also dropped various grenades onto Russian soldiers that were crewmen within those vehicles, and then that's to get out when it was destroyed. Then they hid under the rubble to try to, of course, get concealment, but also as cover from the explosive yield of some of these grenades that are becoming more and more lethal following a lot of innovation on the front line. And so that video, which also shows vehicles advancing along this particular road over here near the ruins of houses, confirms to us the Russians are now beginning to more freely operate around here. But then the drawback is, of course, the fact that the 79th Brigade is still very present here and is just continuing to target them with these drones as the Russians continue to advance. In terms of the gain made by the Russians, we can say their maximum extent would be 700 meters in this sort of northwestern direction. And now, based on the numbers of vehicles destroyed from the 79th, we could see these assaults are much smaller in scale than the ones from last week, where we saw, in some cases, dozens of vehicles throughout in the entirety of the day coordinating and trying to overrun a rather wide part of the front line. Of course, I could see it surging again. I wouldn't be surprised if it does, if the Russians are really bullish about their possibilities of just in one swoop being able to clear out all of these Ukrainian salients. And then I could definitely see a case where they do ramp up the extent of their vehicular assaults. But then there are also the disadvantages of that, given the fact that it becomes much easier to spot from much farther out by the Ukrainians, and they're more prepared, and then there's more risk to a larger amount of vehicles in the same period of time. And so what you're seeing here is that there were more limited Russian armored operations, of course still leading to casualties, both human casualties and vehicular casualties. We could see how it leads to actual gains inching through house by house within this village, which is highly contested. The Ukrainians are definitely not giving it up without a fight. Now moving on to the Pokrovsk direction, we're zooming in on the gains marked in yellow. You can see 3 new polygons. First one shows the Russian forces have just completely solidified control over Novosibirsk Persha. We've known this for a week now. And now those same garrisons that were fighting around here, like the 114th Brigade, which I believe is right over here, you can see it, they're beginning to expand westwards, taking over all of these lower lying fields that are on the east bank of the river. And as a result, and really due to an uncontested Ukrainian response, the Russians have been able to very quickly advance about 2 kilometers southwards and are now beginning to flank Mezhove. They already have control and access to this road that leads directly into the hamlet, and they're also physically reaching its eastern flank. And so Mezhove itself, I don't know if there's even a Ukrainian presence here anymore because of how disadvantaged it is, because its back is facing the river, albeit very narrow. It's also on a really low-lying floodplain at the line of contact and doesn't have trenches protecting its forward perimeter. And so just as a whole, defending there is difficult. But then you have to look at the nearby defenses and what the implications are, because you have this Russian push coming from the western bank through the heights, and that's really a significant advance by the Russians made today, and that's putting a lot of pressure on the Ukrainian platoons that are covering in these various strong points. And then at the same time, the Russians that are still on the eastern bank are beginning to put on the pressure from that same direction that we hadn't seen previously this past week. Now it's beginning to uptick, and dispersing or distributing the pressure across those 2 fronts does leave the Ukrainians overwhelmed and overextended and unprepared, because frankly they weren't expecting to have to defend on 2 fronts when they set up these defenses and delegated the task for the Ukrainians to defend in these particular regions. But now they're going to have to out of necessity. And so you can see how it puts the Ukrainians that are really in these blue salients over here in a lot of danger, and especially because Mezhove and Komishivka are really within the line of contact, within the purview of the Russians, under constant fire. And that makes it way harder for any sort of Ukrainian garrison to hold on even further northwards in one of these defensive nodes. So again, Russians captured 1.3 square kilometers west of Novosibirsk Persha. They also captured, if we're looking north, what amounts to 1.2 square kilometers of territory east of Zhelane. There's 2 reasons why the Russians advanced through here. First of all, they want to just fully solidify control over the hills that I see is marked over here with this red rectangle. This hill extends all the way to the tributary of the Vavcha River that extends out and then is just north of Komishivka. But there are other hills that we can mark that are located further south that the Russians will definitely be looking at in the near future. But for now, they advance through this area, trying to get control over the dominant heights. These heights, of course, overlook, for one, these trenches over here, like we talked about, but also it means that Zhelane's perimeter is really close to being sealed. The only vector through which the Ukrainians have to continue resupply and then eventually withdraw is this 2.5 kilometer sort of sphere where sort of meniscus shape is formed, and that's where the Ukrainians have the option to then withdraw from towards Novozhelane. And a lot of this is being forced due to the Russians having a lot of success in taking over this initial trench over here and then pushing even further southwards, taking over additional tree lines and then flanking the Ukrainians. This is something that is becoming so apparent over here in this part of the front line. So many villages that the Ukrainians simply can't protect and also protect their flanks simultaneously. So, of course, they're going to put more resources into protecting the village itself, putting personnel in the basements, but then there aren't as many to man the actual flanks where you have the tree lines, and that's where the Russians really thrive at the moment. Despite all of the losses that I know for sure are occurring due to FPV strikes, you still have the majority that are passing through the tree lines and doing so at a quick pace, sometimes with motorcycles. And then at that point, it's really difficult for the Ukrainians to conduct a counterattack. Those just become too costly, and then they are already in a weakened position and are already flanked from several directions. And you can see that occurring in real time in Zhelane. So we're going to keep on covering that. But looking a bit northwards at the same time, we have reporting from Petrenko, Deep State, etc. You can see it marked over here. The Russian forces actually advanced just to the east of Lysychne. They're very close to taking over that hamlet. Let's see the extent of the Russian advance just south of Timofivka. 1.2 kilometers field that amounts to 1 square kilometer. And it also means that all of the regions that are east of this horizontal or vertical road over here that you see marked, that I'm bringing down with this red line, that was so hotly contested by the Ukrainians when they had their 2 battalions or elements of those 2 battalions from the 31st Brigade hold up in between Lozhivatske and the rail line. Now, all of that defending that was done with the hopes of maintaining control over a semblance of the hills in the region, all of that has been lost, and not a single iota of the heights in this region are still under Ukrainian control. All of them have been taken over by the Russians. At this very moment, the Ukrainian forward positions are on low-lying valleys overlooked by the newly taken Russian positions that are overlooking Ivanivka, Lysychne, and Zviridonivka. And Lysychne is just so close, and you have a very obvious route through this paved road to enter into the hamlets, and it's just a few houses. And so I see it really going the same way as the fighting in Timofivka or in Vesely did, for instance. And that is not good. It would mean that the Ukrainians would really have to try to bank on building, or not really building, but just sending in reinforcements to defend in this region between Ivanivka and Zvirodonivka, just to try to temporarily stabilize the situation, diffuse any sort of exploitations until really reinforcements do have to arrive, and the Ukrainians, regardless of all their manpower issues, do have the ability to shuffle units around. It's not in an organized manner, but they do have the ability to just plug in holes utilizing elements from other units, even if they're from key parts of the front line. And that's something that has to be done at this point, because the only unit that I've seen added in a recent time is the 151st Mechanized Brigade. Maybe some of the other newly created mechanized units or infantry units that were created, 152nd, 53rd, 4th, 5th. Those ones, a lot of them have not seen that much frontline experience, but regardless, just in terms of pure manpower, they could be moved into this region. I don't see a reason why they haven't been moved in at this point. I know the 153rd Brigade has some experience fighting around Kharkiv, but that's about it. The 3 other units, I'm not too sure about. Also, speaking of units, we have this video from August 3rd. It was released by the 30th Motor Rifle Brigade. This is a Russian unit that we knew about that was generally floating around here, captured at Cherotine. We didn't actually know if they were fighting west of Pokrovsk, but now they released this video of their squads operating within Vesely and storming some of the houses there. And so now we know that this unit is also involved, which does also bolster the Russian manpower in the region. And it's not just any sort of random territorial units. It's one that arguably has the most experience in this part of the front line and can now continue pushing forward after a period of time when they were relatively inactive and were probably resting. Now, moving on to the Toretsk front, despite all of the reinforcements that have been moved in, even this past fortnight, there have been some new units moved in that we've talked about, like the 100th Mechanized Brigade, which interestingly came from the same area where the Russians are now advancing around in Timofivka and Lysychnya that we just talked about. And that shows you how a lot of the rotations are not being done from the rear or from less important parts of the front line. They're being done from key areas, just constantly being moved around. And that's another huge issue. But in any case, looking here, the Russians have just been able to very quickly push through the suburbs of Toretsk, pushing through Zalizhny, Pivnishny, and also Druzhba. Doing so after about, you could say, 3 weeks of very heavy Ukrainian resistance, where all the reinforcements were thrown in and engaged in heavy house-house fighting for a very notable period of time. You could say they were able to stabilize the lines and even regain some ground around these apartment complexes. But at a certain point, the attrition rates were too high. The coordination between the units was probably too poor. And the Russians were still emboldened given the sort of elevation component, the fact that they were starting to receive more reinforcements. The Russians, albeit not at a large pace in this particular region. But as I said before, the general situation when it comes to firepower and also to the underlying topography always did favor the Russians. We can look more specifically into it as I talk about the gains. And that just sort of in a combination caused a rather large collapse in the Ukrainian lines, especially around Zalizhny. And at that point, with the southern flank of the Ukrainian defense line being compromised, it also began to show cracks in the north, which is what we're going to talk about today. And so beginning with the southwestern part of Zalizhny, we have this geolocation indicating that there was a Russian advance. Let's mark the extent. It's a Russian advance of about 1 kilometer, 900 meters. And it also means that the Russians are about, if we're measuring it, 1 kilometer away from the southernmost portion, the southern district of Toretsk, which is probably more separate than the center of the city, but it is still notable. And there aren't many sort of physical barriers surrounding the Russians now from this district of Toretsk, which is an important one. It does have a lot of apartment buildings, some not that high in elevation, but still it also provides a route to reach some of the final slag heaps that the Ukrainians maintain control of in this region. And those can be used to more generally dominate the entire river valley on which Toretsk is located. And so that would be horrible for the Ukrainians to lose, especially from the southern flank. And so now seeing this Russian advance, it was only one Russian soldier filmed in this video, and they were targeted with a grenade that was dropped by a Ukrainian drone. But what this means to us is that there is such a little coverage by the Ukrainians is that the Russian forces are able to move in small DRG forces, reconnaissance elements into these regions really without being able to get pushed back in a timely manner. But of course, they could still be targeted by drones from above. What it does mean, though, is that there are issues with the Ukrainians in the substation region that could be taken over as it's being flanked from the north. So the Russians are very close to this 330 kilovolt electric substation. And then looking a bit northwards, it also presents some issues for the Ukrainians that are trying to protect the flanks of this southern slag heap. This slag heap is now severely compromised because you have the Russians pushing from the south, and that's really making it difficult for the Ukrainians to sort of get breathing space and move in new supplies to hold the line over here. And then they're also getting even more intensely attacked and bombarded from this northern flank here, where the Russians are only a couple hundred meters away from taking it over. And so at that point, when you're just getting directly assaulted and you're engaged in immediate fighting with the front line, it does decrease a lot of the usefulness of such a slag heap. But when you're talking about sort of like the immediate frontline combat against Russian soldiers, it does still have the advantage of being, of course, on higher elevation. So the Ukrainians that still are here, they could at the very least overlook the Russian forces as they advance. But in terms of the bigger picture, looking deeper to the Russian rear, looking towards these forested regions, open fields, they're not able to do that right now because their focus is much more insular, much more towards protecting their immediate surroundings. And even with all of that taken for granted, the Russian forces are still making gains over here and are still pushing pretty deep in this region, and do have now the ability to flank it from several axes, which makes it harder for the Ukrainians to defend here for an extended period of time. What it does mean is that following the fall of the slag heap, really all of the southern defense line that's built around this diagonal road will be severely compromised, and at that point, the 32nd Brigade won't be able to do much to prevent the Russians and their DRGs from pushing further northwestwards. The DRGs are really going to have a field day in these forested regions. They're going to be able to advance through them. Of course, the main fighting force won't be able to solidify control for a while, but the DRGs do have the opportunity then to begin crossing through these trees, through the forested regions under concealment, and begin harassment operations on the Ukrainians within Toretsk city itself, which is something that really they would have hoped would happen much farther into the future when they would have finalized more of their sort of urban defense plans. Of course, there still are a lot of advantages for the Ukrainians in Toretsk, but they definitely were hoping that the line, this diagonal line that I kept on talking about from last month, would be able to hold in order to buy time for the Ukrainians to sort of build up the protection around Toretsk city. And now we're not going to be able to see that. The Ukrainians won't have the same leeway that they were hoping to have. And you can see that really manifests itself with this really large gain that occurred today within Pivnishne. The Russian forces advancing a total of 1.4 kilometers. Let's look at the extent over here. It's a gain of around 1.5 kilometers westwards. Really significant, because what it means is that now the Russians do have a solid front line running from all the way to the north in northeastern Druzhba and the Bakhmutovka River, then going all the way south to the Zalizhne suburb. Now the front line is much more sort of linear. There aren't as many salients and compromised positions for the Russians. And so now they have a very strong attack vector, starting off with the rail line, but also this very deep push through the actual private residential areas that was conducted by the Russian forces. And what we could see based on the video here is that there was a Ukrainian squad in a Humvee trying to hold the line over here following the Russian push, but it was destroyed by the Russian side. There were also Ukrainian squads spotted, and so Air Force was called in, and there were strikes conducted on some of the houses over here. And then in the aftermath, you could see, based on this drone footage from August 4th, a Russian soldier sort of peeping out and moving through the houses over here, which confirms to us that now they are only, if we're measuring it, about 100 or 300 meters away from this local highway that I talked about as being the sort of main dividing line between the eastern and western parts of Toretsk suburbs. It also means that the Russians are rather close to the second slag heap. This slag heap is also under pressure from the southeastern direction here, but now another vector is going to begin putting pressure on it. And the same thing goes for all the trenches here. They are also under severe danger. The Ukrainians, at this pace, are not going to be able to maintain control over those static defenses, and then the Russians will be able to overrun them, as we've seen occur already with some of the defenses marked in yellow further south around Zalizhne being taken over by the Russian forces, which of course is antithetical to the entire point of having built those defenses here and connecting them together in the first place.